This is not just the story of a revolution. It is the story of hunger, betrayal, and the fall of a king. A nation that once bowed before a crown now raised its fists against it. From the echoing cries of starving peasants to the thunder of the guillotine, France became a battlefield between power and justice. The French Revolution was not only the end of a monarchy, it was the birth of a new world, written in fire, blood, and sacrifice. France in 1788 was a nation divided. On one side stood the monarchy, living in unimaginable luxury, and on the other were millions of ordinary people struggling to survive. King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, spent their days in the grand palace of Versailles, surrounded by gold, jewels, and servants. Their feasts were extravagant, their balls lavish, and their lifestyle seemed completely detached from the realities outside the palace gates. While the king's advisors debated minor financial matters, the country itself was drowning in debt. Wars and excessive spending had left the treasury nearly empty, and the crown borrowed endlessly from foreign creditors, pushing the nation closer to collapse. The majority of the population, the Third Estate, bore the brunt of the kingdom's economic troubles. Farmers, laborers, and artisans worked tirelessly, paying heavy taxes that funded the king's luxury and the privileges of the clergy and nobility. They were forbidden from enjoying the same rights and freedoms as the upper estates, and even basic necessities like bread were often too expensive. Food shortages had become a common reality. Years of failed harvests meant that peasants were constantly hungry, and urban workers in Paris faced skyrocketing bread prices. Starvation and frustration were everywhere, creating a dangerous tension beneath the surface of society. Meanwhile, the First Estate, the clergy, lived comfortably, exempt from most taxes and often owning large tracts of land. The Second Estate, the nobility, enjoyed political influence, wealth, and privileges that seemed almost untouchable. Their estates were large, their feasts extravagant, and their lives free from the burdens that weighed down the common people. The contrast between their comfort and the suffering of ordinary citizens created a growing resentment that quietly simmered in every village, town, and city. The financial situation of France was alarming. The government had borrowed heavily to finance wars, including its involvement in the American Revolution, and to maintain the extravagant lifestyle of the royal family. The treasury was empty, debt was massive, and attempts to reform the tax system failed repeatedly. Ministers warned of crisis after crisis, but the monarchy was slow to act. Every failed attempt to address the nation's problems made the common people angrier, while the king's detachment from reality only deepened their sense of injustice. By 1788, the cracks in the crown were impossible to ignore. Ordinary people began questioning the monarchy's authority. Small acts of rebellion and murmurs of dissatisfaction spread through taverns, markets, and villages. The divide between the privileged few and the struggling majority had grown too wide to bridge. What had been a distant concern for the elite was now a desperate and pressing reality for the masses. France was a nation teetering on the edge, and every indulgence of the wealthy seemed to push the country closer to an inevitable explosion. The foundations of the kingdom were shaking, and the age of revolution was quietly gathering strength. By 1789, the tension in France had reached a breaking point. The Third Estate, representing the vast majority of the population, had grown increasingly frustrated with a system that ignored their voices. The monarchy remained indifferent to the suffering of ordinary people, and attempts at reform were constantly blocked by the First and Second Estates. The Estates General, a meeting of representatives from all three estates, had not been convened for over 150 years. When King Louis XVI finally called it in May 1789, it was intended to solve the financial crisis, but it instead revealed the deep divisions within French society. The First and Second Estates continued to insist on their privileges, while the Third Estate demanded a greater say in decision-making. They wanted fair voting and representation, but their demands were largely ignored. Frustration quickly turned to anger. On June 17, the Third Estate boldly declared itself the National Assembly, claiming the right to represent the French people and take action on matters of state. When they were locked out of their meeting hall, they moved to a nearby tennis court, where they swore the famous tennis court oath. They promised not to disband until France had a new constitution and a system that represented the people, not just the monarchy and nobility. Meanwhile, unrest was spreading through the streets. Rumors of troops being sent to suppress the people fueled fear and anger in Paris. Artisans, laborers, and peasants organized protests demanding justice and access to food. The city was alive with tension. Ordinary citizens who had long suffered in silence began to feel the power of collective action. Demonstrations and riots became more frequent, reflecting a population on the edge of rebellion. The economic crisis worsened the situation. Bread, the staple of the French diet, was scarce and expensive. Families could not feed their children, and hunger became a powerful motivator for revolt. The monarchy's failure to address the food shortage was seen as a betrayal. Ordinary people began to see themselves as defenders of justice and the nation, while the king and his advisors were seen as obstacles to survival. In rural areas, peasants began resisting feudal dues and taxes, sometimes violently. Old resentments resurfaced as villages revolted against landlords and officials, destroying records of debts and demanding relief. The sense that change was not only necessary but inevitable grew stronger by the day. Across France, the people were awakening to the idea that their fate was in their own hands. By the summer of 1789, the stage was set for a national uprising. The combination of political frustration, economic hardship, and social inequality created a powder keg. The Third Estate had taken its first steps toward challenging the monarchy, and the momentum of change was unstoppable. What began as calls for reform quickly became a movement that would sweep away centuries of privilege and power, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic revolutions in history. By July 1789, Paris was a city on edge. Tensions between the monarchy and the people had escalated, and the streets were filled with anger, fear, and anticipation. The National Assembly had declared its intentions to reform the government, but the king remained hesitant, and rumors spread that he might use the army to crush the movement. The people of Paris, desperate for security and action, prepared to take matters into their own hands. The Bastille, a fortress and prison in the heart of Paris, had long been a symbol of royal authority. Though it held only a handful of prisoners at the time, it represented the monarchy's power to imprison anyone at will. For the citizens of Paris, the Bastille was not just a prison. It was a symbol of oppression, injustice, and the unchecked power of the king. The idea of taking it over captured the imagination of the city's population and became a rallying point for revolution. On the morning of July 14, thousands of Parisians gathered, armed with makeshift weapons, and a determination born of years of suffering. They demanded the release of political prisoners and the surrender of weapons stored inside the fortress. The governor of the Bastille, Marquis de Launay, initially attempted to negotiate, but tensions quickly escalated. The crowd grew impatient and violent, hurling insults and rocks at the guards. Fighting broke out, and soon the fortress was under siege. The battle was chaotic. Gunfire and smoke filled the streets as revolutionaries pressed forward, determined to seize control. Inside, the soldiers defending the Bastille were outnumbered and overwhelmed. By the evening, the fortress fell. Marquis de Launay was captured and executed by the crowd, a brutal warning to anyone who opposed the revolution. The victory was not just military, it was symbolic. The fall of the Bastille demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge royal authority and emerge victorious. The news of the Bastille's fall spread quickly across France, inspiring similar uprisings in other cities and towns. Citizens began organizing militias, seizing weapons, and preparing to defend themselves. The monarchy, once considered invincible, now appeared vulnerable. The storming of the Bastille had transformed political discontent into a full-scale revolution. The significance of July 14 went beyond the fortress itself. It marked the moment when the people of France realized that they could no longer rely on the king or the aristocracy to protect their interests. Power was shifting. The Third Estate, long oppressed and ignored, had shown that their collective strength could challenge centuries of privilege and reshape the nation. What began as an act of desperation became a defining moment in history, a spark that would ignite further upheaval, radical change, and the eventual transformation of France. The storming of the Bastille was not just a victory over a fortress. It was the beginning of a revolution that would challenge the very foundations of monarchy and social hierarchy. The events of that day set the tone for the coming months and years, proving that the people, united in purpose, could bring even the most powerful institutions to their knees. By October 1789, the unrest in Paris had reached a critical point. Food shortages were worsening, and the price of bread, the staple of the French diet, had become unbearable for ordinary families. Hunger was no longer just a personal struggle, it had become a political force. On October 5, thousands of women, mainly market sellers known as the fishwives of Paris, took to the streets demanding bread. Their anger was fueled not only by scarcity, but by the frustration that the monarchy had failed to address their suffering. The march began in the marketplaces, where women confronted bakers and grain merchants. They demanded affordable bread and an end to hoarding and profiteering. As the crowd grew, men joined in, turning what started as a protest over food into a political demonstration against royal authority. Armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and whatever they could find, they marched toward Versailles, the symbol of the king's detachment and privilege. The journey from Paris to Versailles was tense and dangerous. Along the way, the crowd's numbers swelled, and their determination intensified. When they arrived at the palace, they confronted the guards and demanded to speak with the king. Louis XVI initially tried to calm the situation with promises and negotiations, but the women were relentless. They refused to leave until the king acknowledged their suffering and took action to ensure food for the people. The march forced the monarchy to confront the reality of the revolution. The queen, Marie Antoinette, attempted to maintain composure, but the anger and determination of the crowd made it clear that the royal family could no longer ignore the people's demands. Under immense pressure, Louis XVI agreed to move the royal family from Versailles to Paris. This relocation placed the king and his family under the watchful eyes of the revolutionaries and marked a significant loss of royal authority. The March of the Women was a turning point in the French Revolution. It demonstrated that ordinary citizens, particularly women, could directly influence political events. It also highlighted the growing power of collective action and the vulnerability of the monarchy. The king, once distant and untouchable, was now exposed to the very people he had governed from afar. This event also revealed the broader social unrest within France. Peasants and urban workers were increasingly willing to challenge traditional hierarchies, and the revolution was no longer limited to political leaders or intellectuals. It had become a mass movement driven by the basic demands of survival and justice. The March of the Women showed that hunger could be a powerful motivator for change, and that the people, united in purpose, were capable of reshaping the nation. The relocation of the royal family to Paris marked a symbolic shift. Power was no longer solely in the hands of the king and nobility. It had begun to move toward the people. From that moment, the French Revolution took on a new intensity, setting the stage for radical reforms, political conflict, and a struggle that would forever alter the course of French history. By 1793, the French Revolution had entered one of its most violent and radical phases. The monarchy had fallen, and the king had been executed, but the country remained unstable. Factions within the revolution began to clash over how to shape the future of France. The most radical of these groups, led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, gained control and launched a period known as the Reign of Terror. Their goal was to protect the revolution from internal and external enemies, but their methods were ruthless. Fear and suspicion became tools of governance. Anyone suspected of opposing the revolution could be arrested and tried for treason. The trials were often swift and unfair, with little chance for defense. Thousands were sentenced to death, many by the guillotine, the machine that had become a symbol of revolutionary justice. Nobles, clergy, and even former revolutionaries were executed if they were deemed a threat. The Reign of Terror created a climate of fear that reached into every corner of France. Robespierre justified these extreme measures as necessary to preserve liberty and equality. He argued that the revolution itself was under threat, and that only through strict enforcement of revolutionary ideals could France survive. However, the line between justice and cruelty quickly blurred. Political enemies disappeared overnight, letters and conversations were monitored, and ordinary citizens lived in constant fear of being denounced. The same principles of freedom and equality that had inspired the revolution were now being used to justify violence and oppression. The Reign of Terror also had a profound impact on daily life. Communities were divided as neighbors accused one another of disloyalty. Families feared the slightest misstep, and loyalty to the revolution became a measure of survival. The economy struggled under the constant instability, and the fear of imprisonment or execution overshadowed the hope for reform. Paradoxically, the revolution that had promised freedom and equality now demanded obedience to survive. Despite the fear, some citizens continued to support Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. They believed that harsh measures were necessary to protect France from foreign armies and internal conspiracies. France was at war with several European powers, and the revolutionary government claimed that extreme measures were needed to ensure the survival of the nation. The Reign of Terror was therefore framed as a defense of the revolution itself, a struggle to preserve liberty, even as it curtailed the freedoms of the people. By the end of 1794, the Reign of Terror had claimed tens of thousands of lives. It left a deep mark on French society, showing both the power and the danger of revolutionary ideals. The radical measures had maintained the revolution for a time, but had also sown distrust and fear. The Reign of Terror became a warning of how quickly ideals can be consumed by violence, and how the pursuit of justice can become a tool of oppression. France had been transformed, but the cost was staggering, and the nation would continue to grapple with the consequences for years to come. After the fall of the monarchy, France faced a historic and unprecedented question: what should be done with King Louis XVI? Once considered almost sacred, the king was now viewed as a symbol of oppression and the source of the country's suffering. The National Convention, dominated by revolutionaries, decided to put him on trial for treason. The trial was both a legal proceeding and a political statement, marking the end of centuries of royal authority. Louis XVI was accused of conspiring with foreign powers to undermine the revolution and of betraying the French people. The evidence included letters and reports suggesting he had communicated with monarchs in Austria and Prussia, seeking military intervention to restore his power. The king's defenders argued that he had been loyal to France and that he had no intent to betray the nation. Yet public sentiment and political pressure made his acquittal nearly impossible. The trial began in December 1792, and it divided the convention. Some believed that executing the king would solidify the revolution and prevent counter-revolutionary forces from gaining strength. Others argued that the execution of a monarch could provoke European nations and lead to war. Louis XVI himself maintained a quiet, stoic demeanor, often speaking only to defend his actions and express hope for reconciliation. His words, however, failed to sway the revolutionary leaders. After weeks of debate, the convention voted on January 15, 1793. By a narrow majority, the decision was made to execute Louis XVI. The sentence was carried out on January 21, 1793. The king was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution in Paris, surrounded by a crowd of citizens who had come to witness the moment. As the blade fell, Centuries of royal authority ended with a single, irreversible act. The execution of Louis XVI shocked Europe. Monarchies across the continent viewed it as a dangerous precedent, while supporters of the revolution saw it as a necessary step toward equality and liberty. Within France, the act served as both a warning and a declaration. The revolution would tolerate no compromise with those who sought to restore the old regime. It also intensified the revolutionary government's resolve to defend itself against internal and external threats, setting the stage for the Reign of Terror. Louis XV's death fundamentally altered the balance of power in France. The monarchy was gone, and the nation was now a republic in theory, though still struggling with chaos, war, and internal divisions. The execution marked the triumph of revolutionary ideals over hereditary authority, but also demonstrated how far the revolution was willing to go to achieve its goals. France had entered a new era, one defined by radical change, the redistribution of power, and the enduring conflict between liberty and control. By 1793 and 1794, the French Revolution, which had begun as a fight for liberty and equality, had entered a period of extreme internal conflict. The execution of King Louis XVI removed the monarchy, but it also created a vacuum of power that revolutionaries struggled to fill. Factions within the revolution began to clash violently, as former allies turned against one another. Political survival became just as urgent as advancing revolutionary ideals, and fear became a guiding force in the lives of both leaders and citizens. Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, who had led the Committee of Public Safety, became the dominant force in the government. They sought to protect the revolution from enemies, both real and imagined, and to ensure that France remained committed to radical republican principles. However, their strict control and the constant atmosphere of suspicion led to increasing paranoia. Former revolutionaries, political moderates, and anyone perceived as insufficiently loyal were denounced, arrested, and often executed. This internal conflict became a defining characteristic of the revolution, showing how quickly a movement for freedom could turn into a system of repression. The period saw widespread purges. Leaders who had once been allies of Robespierre were accused of plotting against the revolution and removed from power. Ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire as denunciations became common. Neighbors and family members reported one another out of fear or personal gain. The very principles that had inspired the revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, were now enforced through terror and surveillance. The population grew wary and fearful, realizing that even those fighting for the same cause could become victims. Meanwhile, France faced external threats from European monarchies that sought to crush the revolution. Wars on multiple fronts placed additional pressure on the government and justified extreme measures in the eyes of the radicals. Robespierre argued that harsh enforcement of revolutionary ideals was necessary to protect the nation, claiming that enemies of liberty could not be tolerated. The combination of war, economic strain, and internal purges created an environment in which survival depended on absolute loyalty to the revolutionary leadership. By mid-1794, the growing climate of fear began to threaten even Robespierre himself. Many who had supported him became concerned that his unchecked power and relentless purges would destroy the revolution entirely. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre was arrested and executed, ending his dominance and signaling the collapse of the Reign of Terror. The revolution had turned on its own leaders, demonstrating that the pursuit of radical change often carried risks as dangerous as the enemies it sought to defeat. The revolution turns on itself left deep scars on French society. The political infighting, executions, and purges had weakened public trust and created divisions that lasted for years. While the monarchy had been destroyed and the republic established, the cost of the revolution was measured in fear, loss, and instability. France had achieved dramatic change, but the experience also showed the dangers of unchecked power, even in the name of justice. The nation emerged transformed, but wary of repeating the mistakes of its most radical years. By the end of the French Revolution, France had been transformed forever. The monarchy was gone, the feudal system was dismantled, and centuries of social hierarchy had been challenged and overturned. Yet the cost of change had been staggering. Tens of thousands of lives were lost during the Reign of Terror. Countless families were torn apart, and the nation had endured years of economic hardship, war, and political instability. The revolution had achieved liberty and equality in principle, but it had also left a legacy of fear and violence that would shape France for generations. The revolution introduced new ideas about citizenship, rights, and government. The notion that all men were equal before the law replaced the rigid social structure of the ancient regime. Laws and reforms were enacted to remove privileges from the nobility and clergy, and property rights were redistributed. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in 1789, became a foundation for modern democracy, asserting the principles of freedom, equality, and justice. These ideas would influence not only France, but also revolutions and political movements around the world for centuries to come. However, the revolution also revealed the dangers of extremism and unchecked power. The Reign of Terror had shown that a government, even one born from ideals of liberty, could quickly become oppressive. Political purges, public executions, and the constant threat of denunciation created a culture of fear that extended far beyond Paris. The conflict between the revolutionary ideals and the methods used to enforce them became a central tension in French society. People learned that the pursuit of justice and equality could sometimes consume the very principles it sought to uphold. The social and political impact of the revolution continued long after the fall of Robespierre. The French people had tasted power and realized that the old order could be challenged. New forms of government were tested, from the Directory to Napoleon's rise, each attempting to balance freedom, order, and authority. Revolutionary symbols, slogans, and ideas continued to inspire citizens, reminding them that change was possible, but also that it could come at a heavy price. Internationally, the French Revolution had a profound effect. Monarchies across Europe were alarmed by the execution of Louis XVI and the overthrow of the French monarchy. At the same time, movements for liberty, equality, and self-determination were inspired by the ideas and example of the revolution. It became a reference point for debates about human rights, governance, and social justice. France had become both a laboratory for radical change and a warning about the risks of extremism. The legacy of the French Revolution is therefore complex. It was a period of extraordinary upheaval, courage, and innovation, but also of violence, terror, and loss. France emerged with new laws, new social structures, and a new understanding of the rights of its citizens. The revolution had achieved what seemed impossible. It had overthrown centuries of tradition and reshaped an entire nation. Yet it left behind a powerful reminder that liberty, once gained, must be protected carefully, and that the pursuit of justice is often a path fraught with both triumph and tragedy. And so, the echo of the guillotine faded into history, but its shadow never left France. A king lost his crown, a queen lost her head, and a people gained their voice. The revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity, but it also unleashed chaos, terror, and rivers of blood. In the ashes of the old monarchy, a new world was born, proving that when the hunger of the people becomes louder than the command of kings, no throne is safe. This was not just the fall of a dynasty. It was the dawn of an era,